What up, RTG?
Mad props! Hey guys, Chris here, the RC Geek, coming to you from the shop, and we've got a new project on the bench today. This is the VQ Warbirds Beechcraft Bonanza Vtail. I don't normally do the civilian stuff, but this is such a cool looking model. I really wanted to give it a go, and so we're going to go full electric on this one. I'm going to be using a 6S 5,000 milliamp hour battery with the smart ESC coupled with a Power 52 E-Flight motor. And that'll be swinging a 12/8 prop on the front. And so also we've got Robart retracts, or the electric retracts. We're going to have full oleo struts in here, and then all high-tech servos. And so we'll give you some highlights as we go in the video as I put this thing together. And yeah, initial impression, guys, it's a really nicely built airframe. The covering is really well done. There's no wrinkling on the covering at all. You know, VQ Warbirds tends to use a silkscreened vinyl kind of a material, and it looks really nice on the airframe. It's very well applied and super smooth, and it looks really good. And so let's get this airplane together. We'll give you some highlights as we go and talk you through what we're doing, and let's have some fun. So let's go. Alright guys, so I wanted to check in real quick. A lot of the major assembly has been completed on the Bonanza. All of the servos are in. We've got the tails on, so all of the basic construction. Things we have left to do, we've got to get the power system in. I do actually have the retract in already, but I got to get the struts in and then finalize the radio and things like that. So not a whole lot left to do. Now to glue the tails, all I did, I used 30-minute epoxy, mix that up. It's important to peel off, of course, the covering in the exposed areas, so that way you get a nice wood-to-wood contact. But the 30-minute epoxy allows you plenty of time to work with it, because you want to make sure that the tails are aligned properly left to right, as well as front to back. So take your time, use the 30-minute, and everything's good to go. So in terms of installing the control horns, they provide those for you. And so what I like to do actually is I will install the control horns with wood screws. And so they don't poke all the way through to the top of the surface. And then what I'll do is once I've got those in and threaded, I'll come back, I'll take them out, put some thin CA in there to harden up the threads. And while it's still wet, I will then screw those screws back in. It's never failed me, and it kind of helps preserve the look of the top of the airplane. The servos themselves, I'm using high-techs all around. On the ruddervators, I've got HS 5496 digital servos, and everywhere else I'm using HS 5085s. They're actually all sized for the mini servos except for the tails. So one of the issues that I did have on the aileron install, there was not sufficient material to really give the servo screws good bite to hold the servo in place. So what I ended up doing, I cut some 1/8 inch light plywood, and I just simply glued that underneath where the screws go, and so then that really hardened it up and really made it hold really tightly in the mount. And these are definitely some things to keep an eye on when you're installing servos yourselves. Sometimes you do have to add a little bit extra, but in the same thing that I did with the control horns, I did with the servos. So once I had the threads in and tapped, backed them out, ran some thin CA in there to harden up the threads, and then screwed those screws back in. All of the hardware, I ended up using the kit hardware, and so it worked out really easily. As a part of that, they use kind of like an easy type of connector. I decided to go ahead and use those. I generally like to use clevises all around, but for the size and power of the model, I wasn't too concerned using those easy type connectors, and they're all metal. The important thing to keep in mind is to really cinch down those set screws really hard. Make sure that nothing can come loose on you, and you should be okay. Otherwise, no real major issues. I did notice in the process of handling, VQ uses a pretty unique kind of like vinyl covering. If you find that it's sagging at all, you can actually put a heat gun to it and it will tighten right up. As I was handling the model, I noticed some areas were kind of starting to sag. So I pulled the heat gun out and it worked out fantastically. Really tightened things up really nicely. Now, one final note, like I mentioned, the retracts are in, really easy to install, especially the mains were especially simple. It really just dropped right in. I did have to Dremel away just a touch of material on the mounts to get them to slip in easily, and then also had to cut away some of the sheeting too. Really small amount just so they would slip in easily. On the nose, it's a firewall mount retract. So what that means is it mounts to the vertical wall that's in the front. Worked out great. It was really simple to install. However, I found that when I tightened in the screws to hold the mount, that there was an impingement. And so what was happening is there's a sleeve over the worm drive, and what was happening is that was, when I was tightening the retract, that was pressing up against a horizontal surface inside the wheel well. So once I sorted that out, what I ended up having to do was just grind away some material with a Dremel, so that way there was no interference occurring. And then once I did that, worked perfectly every time, and no chance of it hanging up at all. Now for the steering setup, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So there's a servo inside the fuselage that runs a push rod down to the retract steering mechanism. It's really important to make sure that that push rod is held tightly in the wheel well area. Otherwise, you're going to get a whole bunch of backlash. So I ended up just using a piece of balsa wood to harden up and stiffen up that connection down there. So that way, there's no way to generate any kind of play based on the push rod moving around. It just needs to be secure in there. Now from here, we're going to get the struts in. I've got full oleo struts from Robart. These are the Robart electric retracts. They're super nice. I'm really happy with them. And so we're going to get those in, and then we're going to get the power system in, and then we'll wrap this up. This airplane will be ready to go, and then we'll be able to take it out to the field. So let's get on to that, and then we'll wrap this up. Alright guys, here is the finished Bonanza. You know, this really builds into a really nice looking airplane. So last we talked, we had to install the motor, we had to install struts, and then do all the finished work to get it all ready to fly. In terms of installing the motor, I actually did a live stream on that. I'm running a Power 52 E-Flight motor, and that's on 6 cells. Well, the motor gets installed onto a firewall, which then gets installed onto 4 bolts, and that whole mount is adjustable depending on which motor you use and whatnot. So there is a dimension that's provided in the instructions, so I just set everything to that to make sure that I had enough space between the cowl when it was installed and then the spinner. And so once I had everything set where I wanted it, tightened it all up, and that was it, and it was ready to go. And from there we just installed the cowl, and I got 4 screws holding that on. Really simple, real easy. The other thing that we needed to get done was to install the struts. Now I'm using Robo struts all around. They're shock absorbing oleo struts. And so on the nose, it was really simple. There's a wire that's pre-installed in the retract mechanism, and so I had to actually cut that with a Dremel and a cutoff wheel, and so that way the strut would slide all the way on. And then once I cut that, just installed it, tightened it up. I did grind a flat spot in there so that that strut couldn't rotate at all. And then that was pretty much it. We already had the steering done and all of that. And then for the main struts, these are, again, the Robo struts, shock absorbing gear, but I had to cut the shafts down in order to fit the wheel well. And they are designed to do that. So it's not a big problem at all. And so again, once I plotted the length that they needed to be cut the shaft with a Dremel and cutoff wheel, and then it fit perfectly into the well, and so just had to do that twice, left and right. Of course, I had to paint all of the struts white because, you know, that's what is on the real airplane, and actually it really helps make achieve the look really well. But the other thing is the landing gear doors. So the main gear doors were super simple. They're actually just glued onto the struts. I created some standoffs using some balsa wood. And then I also created a loop, if you will, so that way I could strap a zip tie through it to hold the door against the strut if the glue ever came loose. And then that was really it. So to set the standoff, I retracted the gear and then used balsa wood to set, you know, where does this need to be. The doors just sit on the bottom of the wing. They don't recess into a well or anything like that, so it's a really simple setup to do. And then from there I ended up creating my own nose doors using a fiberglass sheet and some balsa wood, and so that way they would fit flush to the bottom of the airplane. And then from there I used some nylon hinges from Dubro to hinge the doors, and I used an 027 wire spring that I created, and then that springs the doors down, and then I used a piece of fishing line across the 2 doors, so that way when the nose gear retracts back, it pulls the doors shut. And this is a super simple way to do it. I go in full detail in the live stream, so I definitely would recommend checking that out if you want to do the same thing that I did here. The cowl comes with an LED landing light in it. The easy thing to do is just to use an existing light controller. And then the other thing is I wanted the landing light to turn on and off with the retracts, so that way when the gear come up, the light turns off, and I have an electronic switch in there wide with the retracts, so that way when the gear are down, the switch is on. When the gear is up, the switch is off, so it turns the light off. Now that completed basically the whole assembly. I had to do a little reconfiguring inside to get the CG. The CG and all of the controls are set per the manual. I have not flown this yet, so when I do, I will provide all of my controls for you guys in a full flight review. Interestingly enough, the airplane CG is just about perfectly with nothing in it. So the battery ended up having to be almost right on the CG itself. The retracts run off of a separate 2-cell battery, and so I actually have that battery further back, and I'm at about a 1/4 inch or so forward of the recommended CG. I'm going to start there and then see if I can move it back. Now the power system, I checked the amps, I checked the voltage. I'm pulling about 1400 watts. 60 or so amps, which is perfect. It should fly this airplane fantastically, and it's right in the sweet spot. The motor's not going to get too hot, and it's not going to stress out the batteries at all whatsoever. And so I've got the 5000 pack here, the Smart 5000. There's definitely opportunities to go bigger if I want to. There's plenty of space inside the fuselage, so we'll see what kind of flight times we get with the 5000, and we'll go from there. The last thing I want to talk about is the control setup. Okay, so we've got the V-tail on the back, and so that took some extra considerations because I've got 2 servos, right? One for each tail, but I also have to worry about the steering servo. Now, in the case here, I'm using an AR9350 receiver, which has AS3X in it. I'm not a huge gyro guy usually, but I don't know, I wanted to play around with it in this airplane. And so I have it on a switch, so that way I can completely turn the gyro off, and then I'll tune each of the rates individually, and then once I'm happy with those, I'll combine them all together. That being said, since it is an AS3X receiver, I had to set my tail configuration in the phone app. Spectrum has that Bluetooth connection, which allows you to connect to the receiver and program them via Bluetooth. If I was not using that receiver, if I was using just a standard one, then I would set that configuration in the transmitter. Because actually I originally intended to use a smart receiver, a 6-channel smart receiver. Unfortunately, because of the tail configuration and the steering setup, I needed an extra channel, which is why I went to the other receiver. And so what I ended up doing is I took the steering servo, plugged it into one of the spare channels in the receiver, and then I simply just programmed that channel to rudder, and then that gave me pure steering without any combination of elevator and the rudder combined. So guys, that is it. This is the Beechcraft Bonanza Vtail from VQWarbirds.com. Really nice looking airplane. I love how it looks. Nicely built model. It's nicely finished. Everything goes together really easily. Really looking forward to getting this out to the field and flying it. Once I can, obviously I'll be putting together a full flight review for you guys and letting you know how it goes. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to follow along on social media at the RC Geek. Subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you at the field.